Došli na simpoziju premene v sodobni dramatiki po letu 2000. Good morning, everybody, online and live here in the hall. Welcome to the International Symposium Shifts in Contemporary Drama after the year 2000. Za začetek vabim direktorico gledališkega muzeja Mojco Jan Zoran in dekana AGRFT-ja, da nas pozdravita oziroma da splavita tale naš mednarodni simpozij. Mojca, Tomaž, please.
Dobrodošli v Slovenskem gledališkem inštitutu, dobrodošli vsi, ki ste z nami v živo, kar je posebna čast in privilegij, in dobrodošli tudi vsi, ki nas spremljate prek spleta. Tokratni simpozij, že tradicionalni Amfiteatrov simpozij, obravnava, kot je Gašper omenil, premene v sodobni dramatiki po letu 2000. Da je tema intrigantna ali dražljiva, bi rekla, se je pokazalo tudi potem, da je zasedba res odlična, da je prijavljenih veliko referentov, da se bodo kresale nove ideje, novi pogledi. Konec koncev nas gledališka praksa že pelje v neko smer, ki morda še nima tega teoretskega razmisleka, kajti ta povezava med dramatiko in gledališčem je povezava stalnega prijateljstva in hkrati stalnega prepira. Lahko bi rekla, da pravzaprav neka osnova gledališkega dogajanja od začetka samega gledališča. Tako vesela sem, da vas lahko pozdravim v živo tukaj pri nas, na tem mednarodnem Amfiteatrovem simpoziju, ki ga skupaj organiziramo Akademija za gledališče, radio, film in televizijo Univerze v Ljubljani, Slovenski gledališki inštitut in pa revija Amfiteater. Želim vam prijetno bivanje v Ljubljani, želim vam lep in plodno srečanje in pa veliko novih idej in veselim se tudi že Amfiteatra, ki bo objavil vaše prispevke.
Mojca me je malo spravila za drego, ker je pravzaprav vse povedala. In jaz vam lahko seveda želim veliko iskrečih misli. Zelo sem zadovoljen, da je Amfiteater kot nek skupen projekt Slovenskega gledališkega inštituta in Akademije za gledališče, radio, film, televizijo postal mednarodno uspešna revija, mednarodno uspešna ideja, ki jo razvijate ob trdem delu in vam v tem trenutku se vam zahvaljujem za vse, kar ste storili in vam želim seveda tudi v bodoče, vsem, ki sodelujete pri Amfiteatru, veliko dobrih idej, mi smo pa tu, da vam pomagamo, da jih realizirate. Dobro delo želim. Hvala lepa.
Thanks, Tomaž and Mojca. Hvala. Before we really start, just a few practical information. When the speakers are not obliged to wear masks, so you can speak without a mask, otherwise they are obligatory. We have a very tight schedule, as you have seen. So the moderators will give you a mark 3 minutes before the end of your presentation, and we will ask you to sort of, navigate towards a conclusion at that time. We will see, we have some time space, so some pauses that we can use for some prolongations if needed. However, to start, I would ask Lada Čale Feldman, our first keynote speaker, to present us and to launch us into the discussion of contemporary drama, of the specificities of contemporary drama and challenges that it poses for the analysis. The title of her presentation is Deconstructing and Reconstructing the Fictional Universe on Two Opposite Examples of Contemporary Metadrama. Lada Čale Feldman is a professor from the University of Zagreb. Lada, please, the podium is yours. Of course. So, your presentation? Yes, it's here.
Okay, good morning, everybody. let me first express my really deepest thanks to the organizers for having offered me this opportunity to elaborate a bit longer on my topic. Yes, okay. That's it.
That's fine.
I don't mind.
You want?
Let
Okay.
it stay. Okay.
But-
Thank
so-
you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. So, my aim today is to discuss the relevance and resilience of dramatic theatre, the one relying on the play text preceding a theatrical production, from the perspective of its internal, inherited modes of theorization and autopoietic rejuvenation that seem to spite its supposed demise in the era of the post-dramatic, of the no longer dramatic, or of the post-post-dramatic. An insight into the way these modes are employed in contemporary playwriting could, I believe, bring us closer to understanding how it happens that dramatic text sort of currently bounces back and strikes with a vengeance at all the attempts to reduce it to a purely linguistic and literary entity, and to divorce it from the actualities of the stage, which have always guaranteed its structural specificity. Oops, nothing moves.
It doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't. Okay, its structural specificity, even when it was considered to be just one of the literary types, to use Benjamin Bennett's words. Now, as I announced in my proposal, contemporary playwriting does its best to parallel and engender post-dramatic performances by its own attempts to break free from the closure of representation as the invariant structure of Western theatre, which was attacked by Artaud and famously theorized by Derrida as being metaphysical in kind. The endeavors to escape from this structure have, however, endangered the very notion of drama, for they often take the shape of either lyric or epic strategies of de-dramatization, as was nicely put in the call for papers. But as Liz Tomlin pointedly argued, before one discredits dramatic theatre as being irredeemably predicated upon totality, closure, and temporally progressing fictive cosmos, enclosed in a pre-existing playtext, one should first reflect upon the historical accuracy of this definition, let alone acknowledge a respectable dramatic tradition of self-reflexive critique. Contemporary playwrights revive such self-reflexivity, for instance, when they explicitly refer to crucial instances of the very medium of theatre, to authors, plays, actors, audiences, play acting and spectating, as well as to spaces, i.e. ontologies, these agents and actions are supposed to occupy. Contrary, however, to Tomlin's emphasis on modernist predecessors, Pirandello and Genet, whose metadramatic confrontations with the real certainly figure amongst the most intriguing disruptions of the aforementioned invariant structure, I will here go further back into the history of dramatic theatre. Following namely David Roberts' considerations regarding the way Derrida's discussion of Artaud could serve as a basis for the establishment of the two basic types of metadrama, I will show that the two early modern prototypes that Roberts singles out, Shakespeare's Hamlet and Calderon's Great Theatre of the World, could indeed be used as models for understanding my two chosen extreme points in contemporary metadramatic experimenting. Unlike Lehmann, who seems to disregard the distinction of Artaud's project on one hand from Derrida's deconstruction of it on the other, or unlike performance studies scholars who, to put it with Julia Jarko, seem to demonstrate selective amnesia with respect to Derrida's critique, Roberts first reminds us of how suspicious Derrida is of the Artaudian dream of escape from the closed circle of representation. The traditional theatre Artaud wants to abolish implies, as Derrida recapitulates and Roberts summarizes, the dominance of the word and the primacy of a founding logos, which endows the scene with the following elements: an author-creator, absent, distant, armed with a text, who supervises and controls the meaning of the representation, making the actors enact the will of an invisible master before an audience of spectators, consumers, voyeurs. Derrida, however, also warns that Artaud's theatre of the unrepeatable gesture and self-presence is impossible, since repetition remains unavoidable, and all theatre can do to undermine the aforedescribed theological structure is to lay bare what the circle of representation contains, to represent the limits of representation by representing the representation. Roberts therefore introduces his two types of metadrama according to the opposing strategies they use. Both types stem from the inherent possibility of dramatic theatre to question its own limits by foregrounding the spatial duality it implies, since every drama opens up an actual space of the play and at the same time represents the world as play. The first type of metadrama, the self-critical one, inserts the limits of representation within its own play as world in the form of an insert play, for example, the well-known mousetrap in Hamlet, ordered by an invisible and unreliable ghost in the machine, while the other, the self-affirming type, exemplified by Calderon's Great Theatre of the World, projects the limit out into the world as play, by making the author behind the scene appear out front as the almighty God who both runs and watches the show and who ultimately grants salvation or damnation of any actual audience watching Calderon's play. To summarize the ideological stakes of this opposition, let me finish its all too short explanation by again quoting David Roberts' own words. The one uses reduplication to internalize the origin and causality of the scene, the other to externalize origin and causality. Theologically and historically, the two types point in the opposite directions. The play within the play anticipates through introversion the modern recession of origin, that is, the paradox of self-implication. World theatre looks backwards to reaffirm through extroversion the medieval closure of meaning, whose outcome is the allegory of self-explication. Now, the two contemporary examples that, in my view, make us recall these two types of self-reflexivity are Pascal Rambert's Retour de l'amour and Tim Crouch's The Author. Both these two metadramatic plays, interestingly, bear in their titles some marked associations to Derrida's commentary of Artaud and the described invariant structure of the Western theatre, since the first one seems to allude to the closure of representation, and the second one to the godlike position of the author. Although the French title of Rambert's play was translated in English as The Closing of Love or Love's End, rather than The Closure of Love, I will insist on the elusive impact of the original title, since in my view, the play connects the crisis of love with the crisis of representation in general and the crisis of theatre representation in particular. My choice of Rambert's play could be justified as well by the sheer amount of resonance it provoked, for unlike Tim Crouch's The Author, who premiered in the London Royal Court Theatre but toured mainly in the Anglo-American world, The Closure of Love, as I would translate Rambert's title, has already gained the status of a transnational phenomenon, having so far been performed in more than 20 different languages all over the world, from Brazil and the United States, via Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, to Egypt, Russia, China, and Japan. However, in contrast to Crouch's much-discussed Author, the performing enthusiasm for Rambert's play has so far not been matched by serious scholarly analysis of its planetary appeal. So why precisely The Closure of Love? Let me repeat that closure here is an ambiguous word, signaling both self-containment of a universe and at the same time the end of that universe. In a wish to both denounce and announce the closure of the representation, to end it, to abolish it, meant for Artaud to inaugurate a pure theatre of presence, devoid of any hand that would govern it from the outside, to establish, in a word, pure immanence of life, end of death. In such a theatre, the actor becomes a martyr, permitting his or her own destruction in order to become a spectacle, proving the imminence of negation. Artaud imagines a variety of techniques by which to assault, benumb, and confront the audience to imminent death, let alone to the omnipresence of evil, the foulness of the body, and the need to systematically employ cruelty and terror. Raging against the theatre of his time, he expresses disgust not only for psychological dilemmas, but particularly for the whole cheap sentimentalism and verbalism of bourgeois domestic dramas. Pascal Rambert seems at first glance to be doing quite the opposite. He writes a logorrheic play for the age-old apparatus of the théâtre à l'italienne that claustrophobically and obsessively addresses precisely the trials and tribulations of a typical modern bourgeois marriage. Lacking, however, in dialogics 𝗨𝗃, the closure of love consists of what appear to be two subsequent monologues, but are in fact two monomaniac narrative voices forced into a dramatic clash. As if Rambert, faced with the current trend to represent the world as broken into a Babylonian multitude of narrative ontologies, tried to test the form of drama, to put its current implosions to their utmost limit, to constrain this obsession with self-narration, to be deployed within the common space and time of what Alain Badiou would name the scene of the two, the archetypal drama of sexes. In so doing, Rambert, however, emphasizes the need for the characters to also stay patiently silent for almost an hour each, to listen to the other, and to respond to the other exclusively via their bodies, to silently provoke inadvertent dialogic punctuations, disruptions, hesitations, and modifications, or indeed additional momentum within the monologic texture of the other's speech. We have the impression that the dialogic clash here is not verbal. It takes place between one's language and the other's body. Rambert's actors address each other by their proper everyday names, since the protagonists of the play are, in fact, that is, in the possible world, the fictive universe of the play, just as much as in the actual world of its enactment, actors. In a move much closer to Artaud's poetics than it may seem, Rambert collapses fiction into the living and breathing, embodied actuality of the stage. The space of the play and the world as play are here one and the same space. His imaginary actors are namely caught in the midst of a rehearsal of an unknown play, perhaps a play on love as well, perhaps the very play they are, qua empirical actors, actually acting in. Facing the fatal separation, the man and the woman, thus to express it through a proper paradox, seem to be what they actually are. Two beings actually suffering from painful linguistic blows that their characters emit into each other's bodies, and yet beings who in the very here and now of their irreducible, intimate performing selves are, again, just acting, as if even after the breakup of the couple, they would still be ready to start the rehearsal and the play anew. Indeed, whenever the play is replayed, the actors all around the world call each other by their proper names, confronting their personal bodies and existences to the respective translations of the play, so that this blending of sameness and difference in repetition works on the global level as well. By its very reconfigured, repeatable unrepeatability, Rambert's closure of love reverses and exacerbates the pivotal paradox Derrida detected in Artaud's writing by creating a meta-play, a play within the play, endlessly repeated in the almost same mise-en-scène, but always with different actors, different embodiments, different contexts of the world as play. Contrary, however, to the violent scene of parricide, of killing of the father, that is proclaimed by Derrida to be necessarily haunting the stage Artaud so desperately wanted to clear from God's repressive presence, Rambert's play and its never-ending differential movement is opened up to the terrifying encounter of sexual differences, to the desperate search for an Irigarean, way of love, for a way out of its fatal closure, which, like the closure of representation, results to be founded on what it declaratively tries to eschew: the metaphysics of self-presence, the mirage of the real, and the idea of truth. To replace the originary scene of parricide by the troubling and yet eventually amorous scene of the two means already to challenge the violent logic lurking behind Artaud's ambition to abolish God. As opposed to all the critics of Rambert's piece who praise the play for its universality, either willingly disregarding or completely missing the way in which it poses the question of sexual difference, I argue that the aforementioned meta-theatrical impact depends precisely upon an allegiance to a revision of history and of the blind alley the dominant culture of love seems to be still stuck in from the woman's perspective. There are indeed striking differences in Rambert's play in the way that the male and the female character use language and address the issue of love. The man announces the inevitable closure, the impossibility of a common future, the exhaustion of a certain concept of love. For Stan, the love relationship he is in is now nothing else but an endless repetition of the same, of the theatre of love as the worn-out theatre of representation, the theatre of the sentimental fiction, built upon something occluded, the hidden, cruel truth of negativity, which should now finally be revealed, spelled out, brought out in the open. It is the other, the woman, who is accused of holding too firmly to this fictional, worn-out, sentimental notion of love, of desperately ignoring and pushing away the negativity, of impeding the necessity for it to finally come out, and of pressuring the man to continue along the common path. But what is, according to Stanislas Nordet was the first actor to play this role, so that's why Stan. According to Stan, this hidden truth of love, the repressed ground of its stale theatrical illusion. Clearly, Stan's concept of love is impregnated by psychoanalytic terms, which formulate the relation to the other within the logic of Hegelian recognition and Lacanian desire. It is a logic, let me remind you, which sees desire itself as grounded on the work of negativity, the unsignifiable real, which marks the gap or lack in the constitution of the subject, allotting it to the gaze of the other, making it crave for something behind the other's gaze, a logic, by the way, governing the meta-theatrical structure of the exemplary psychoanalytic tragedy, Hamlet. To falter for a moment in his destructive move, to recollect how love works, to recognize the other, means for Stan, therefore, first and foremost, to evoke Audrey as an outstanding actress, the extraordinary screen and mirror to his own narcissism, and to project onto her the desired fulfillment of his own lack, proving the destructive logic of desire, whose constitutive insatiability produces the mirage of the foreclosed real. Incapable of ever reaching its goal except in death, it can only produce a debasement of being into disposable things, objects and substances. The breakup will therefore, despite Stan's intermittent nostalgic reminiscences of the lost love, soon degenerate into an anticipated dispute over separate items that hold for him, ironically, particular sentimental value. Stan's speech is forcefully modern, or should we say postmodern, steeped in quotations of cliches, ironic or not, in English jargon words like turnover that pollute the French original with contemporary techno-managerial vocabulary, globally spread to kill meaning and communication. Such abuse of language can only lead to war. And perhaps it would not be such a terrible outcome if there were not children around. In the middle of Rambert's performance, just before the moment in which the man and the woman switch their sides on the proscenium, as also their speaking positions, a chorus of children enters, as if interrupting the rehearsal and reclaiming the stage. Not all of these children are Stan's and Audrey's children, and yet, if we recall the modern recession of origins that David Roberts ascribes to the first type of metadrama, which stands for the psychoanalytic plunging into the deep recesses of our memory, then we could say that the entire audience is identifying with their children, who thus become all the children in the world. Here, however, the table turns and the woman starts to talk back. to prevent the man from simply exiting. Her way out is radically different, for she reframes the meta-reference to theatre to serve the right for the other, to answer, and to inaugurate the perspective of the two, especially since the breakup, any breakup, is never exclusively personal. It always somehow affects the entire world. In the temporal scheme of the play, just as in the one of the history of civilization, the woman arrives the second. She is, as Nietzsche would say, a late arrival, since the dinner of language, culture, and civilization to which women have not had the chance to substantially contribute has already been served. The second part of the play will be given over to this internal supplement of the man's logoraic onset, that is, to her revision, to her refusal of the closure, to her challenge of the logic of the same, to her mimesis, her parody, her echo of Stan's speech, to the deployment, that is, of the most cherished Irigarean strategies of deconstruction and dislocation of all closures, of thought, of sexuality, of identity, and above all, of human becoming and of love as its horizon. The woman's counterattack will, as a matter of fact, make the man listen to himself, since it will mock his defilement of language, and especially the very word war, let alone the grandiosity of the role Stan assigned to himself in it, sneaking out as the deserter, as she says, from the battlefield of love, caring little for what this war, the war of words, will produce for their children, as for all the children of the world. Her recollection of their love has nothing to do with splitting of the ego, desires, and projections, but rather with joining seemingly disparate facets of life in daily work, regardless of who or what comes first. Audrey therefore debunks Stan's notion of the real, both in love and in the theatre, as resting on violence and destruction, of an unacknowledged Artaudian fascination with death and cruelty. The body, her body, is for Audrey neither a thing to be exposed, displayed, and debased, nor a mirror or a screen for Stan's, as she mockingly formulates, flamboyant exteriority, but the endangered locus of their common becoming and transcendence, which here replaces the emblematically empty circle, the O of Ophelia's lap, the castration anxiety that, according to Philip Armstrong, lurks behind the epistemological failure of Hamlet's mousetrap. It is from this locus that another attempt will be made by Pascal Rambert's equally humiliated woman to call the man back, although she cannot help but to see in the two of them the inheritors of Masaccio's touching interpretation of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden. The woman prefers to cast herself as Eurydice, holding out her white hand, walking with the man in a common dream, as she says, coming back to life, creating and procreating, opening up the temporality of the two rather than the substantiality of the one. The man will not join her, but the play will still end on an ambivalent note, since the finales of their respective speeches make both man and woman acknowledge the need to continue their work as actors, that is, to continue repeating the play, and to do so as all the lovers of the world, over and over again. As opposed to the internal reduplication and never-ending repetition endorsed by the intensely lit space of the play in Rambert's Clôture de l'amour, disturbed only for a moment by the uncanny irruption of children, reminding the couple who is the unacknowledged internal audience to their theatrical display. Tim Crouch's play, The Author, as I have already suggested, represents metadrama's potential for extraversion, inaugurated by Calderon's Great Theatre of the World. Now, I am far from suggesting that Tim Crouch's post-dramatic The Author longs for a medieval faith in the unshakable ground of God's true presence, but the structure Crouch envisaged and the topics discussed by his characters certainly do invoke a parallel tradition, which, just like Rambert's piece, places theatre-making squarely into the field of ultimate ontological, epistemological, and above all, ethical questions of humanity. This cunning metadrama could figure indeed as an extreme version of David Roberts' second type, since here the space of the play, just as much as the world of the play, is almost non-existent. The entire action takes place as if outside of drama, in the intensely lit space of the audience, and in what seems to be and what seems to be, the form of, again, narrative address by theatre producers to the flabbergasted members of the actual public, divided in two groups facing each other, with only a tiny vacant corridor in between them. The producers are visible and present, seated amongst others, only talking about their preparations for the show, which the audience never actually witnesses, except for one very short scene, just to have a glimpse of what it was supposed to be, of the material the producers tested for it, a tiny reenactment of a strip of very crude, violent reality, a dialogue with a raped young woman, Karen. The actors of the piece are instructed to appear under their own real-life names, but the name of the author and the director of the play, Tim Crouch, always remains the same regardless of the actor who would take his part. If Rambert's imagined and real actors can act as if no one is watching them, as if the fourth wall is shielding them from any kind of public responsibility, only to be reminded that there is an internal audience that they ignore just as much as the outer, real one, Crouch reverses the theatrical situation by focusing on all actual audiences of his play and by openly accusing them to consist of consumers and voyeurs who display the same kind of irresponsible indifference towards the obscenity of what they nevertheless insatiably watch, be it violence in the theatre or outside of it, on the screen or in their neighborhoods. Besides framing the entire play by the appearance and the monologues of the very author who created it, supposedly the same Tim Crouch that also appears in it as the actor playing himself, Crouch parallels Calderon's structural tautology in his complete conflation of acting with the chance to act ethically. Just like Calderon's members of humanity who are given an opportunity to exercise their free will and yet listen to the prompter named Faith, who advises them to choose to do good and thus acquire a place next to the author God at the supper he invites them to after the performance, so also all the characters in Crouch's play, the members of the actual audience included, are given the opportunity to take a stand when it comes to the ethical meaning and purpose of theatre representation, especially the one representing graphic images of violence. Instead of Faith that figures as prompter in Calderon's piece, here, however, we have an ironic, if not diabolic advisor, a character of a deluded member of the audience that was initially played by Adrian Howells, who prompts the audience to respond to his infantile enthusiasm for theatre's most superficial attractions, thus reminding us of the larger frame, the one in which theatre itself is nothing but a commodity on the media market. The irony befalls the figure of the author as well. The contemporary godlike creator turns out now to be a monomaniacal torturer of the actors he summoned, so absorbed in his righteous need to show the violence of the world to the world that he inevitably perpetuates it, thus destroying the actors' lives, making them victims of a morality play with doubtful didactic outcomes. Unlike Rambert's actors, who search for their truth, the truth of their love in other representations, not only in Masaccios picture, but also in myths of Adam and Eve, or Orpheus and Eurydice, and even in the myth of John Lennon's and Yoko Ono's love, Crouch's characters search for the cause and origin of violence outside of representation. The character of the actress, Esther, initially interpreted by Esther Smith, claims that she went to the beaten women's shelter in order to understand the character of Eshma she has to interpret, and she joins the rest of the troupe in their visit to an unknown East European country in war, just to grasp why a man would rape his own daughter. Even the author, Tim Crouch, declares that he decided to rehearse his own suicide by drowning in a coffin-like tub of a spa, just to taste what death would be like, as well as to assume the ultimate responsibility for all the symbolical capital he used to exploit by producing images of violence to gain success and fame. To sum up the curious resonances with Calderon's emblematic metadrama, There is in Tim Crouch's play an allegorical play by the explicit designation that the author professes within the play. Even a mention of a dinner party to which the author invites his actors at the end of the show, just as the godlike author does in the great theatre of the world. Crouch's dinner party, featuring appropriately cooked lamb, the Lamb of God, ends, however, in the horror of all horrors. If Calderon's innocent unborn child ends in a limbo, since it never had a chance to even taste what ethics means, here a child appears in the guise of Esther's baby, innocently sleeping, while the author, as again he himself confesses to the audience, masturbates to the internet child pornography he watches on the computer screen when the rest of the guests and his own wife go to sleep. The revulsion that this confession may generate among the members of the audience, and it did, many members left, is thoroughly welcome, for the author finally kills himself indeed, right after having solemnly announced that writing has left him, before he even had the chance to leave it first and abandon the space of the play, as we may add, Artaud had anyway wished the author to do. The contrasting two examples I decided to reflect upon in this paper thus nicely point to the limits of contemporary dramaturgical ambitions to match the prevailing impulse of forgetting the pressures and obligations towards a pre-existing playtext and devise theatre that would spring out of its own internal and momentary necessity. Whether engulfed in age-old universals such as the issue of love and the question of sexual difference, or tackling the thorniest of all violent outrages currently plaguing the world. The two dramatic constructions, deconstructions, and reconstructions of representation that I chose as exemplary cannot but turn around their very theatrical conditions, that is, around the fundamental puzzle that never slipped from the minds of their author. What's theatre got to do with it? By rejuvenating inherited modes of metadramatic self-questioning, they testify to the fact that theatre, even the dramatic one, was never meant to be a representation of something absent from the here and now, of its actual happening, of its performance, of its immediacy, its production of feelings, meanings, and epiphanic moments. But the reverse is true as well. The theatre is never only about the here and now of the sheer spontaneity and eventfulness. It is, as again Benjamin Bennett would insist, always closely tied to the very phenomenon of literacy and writing as a challenge posed by orality, corporeality, and contextuality to the apparent semiotic fixity and narrative closure of the written script. It is this warning, I think, that the two metadramas I have just discussed bring sharply to light, urging us to reconsider the somewhat constraining, if not deadening, field of the here and now, precisely in order to be able to repeat, and by repeating, to lovingly engage in human becoming. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would now like to open a discussion. Do you have a microphone? Okay. So, if there are any questions really from the audience, okay. They're signaling me that we need to speak in the microphone for the people that are listening online. Any questions?
I think that everybody here in Slovenia is quite familiar with Closure of Love. It was a great performance. But I just wanted to add one thing. It is very interesting that 𝗀𝗶𝘁𝗺𝗁 avoided this intrusion of children on the stage, which I think is a crucial part of the dramaturgy of that piece. And that in a way, with his interpretation, he missed a lot of the impact Rambert initially envisaged.
I would like to ask you one thing, and this is the concept of authenticity. I think in both cases, what you discussed, so that in Rambert's piece, that he uses the actual names of actors and that sort of does two monologues. He's trying to get the authenticity of the actors, sort of to bridge this gap between the impossible seizure between actors as real people and, of course, the fictional characters they enact, what Erika Fischer-Liefde discusses in her book. And that Crouch seems to be doing the same thing with posing the actors among the audience. So my question would be, is this authenticity sort of a concept we could use as a common ground of the modern playwriting?
Definitely, this this reliance upon the double nature of the performer is one of the salient, let's say, features of post-dramatic, playing upon the various levels of reality. But I must say authenticity is also a very dangerous word, because Derrida himself would jump and say, well, what is authentic? We are always, created by certain scripts that already exist. So, in a way, by being themselves, they are nevertheless reproducing the script that already exists, the script of love, the whole heritage, for instance, in 𝗏𝗏, the whole heritage of Western drama is somehow inscribed into the world as well. So even when they think that they authentically love, they reproduce a script. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, with Tim Crouch, there was a lot of discussion with him around the question of him playing himself. So the interviewers always focused on his person, on the amount of exposure he was willing to take as a risk, to say that he was masturbating in front of the audience, and to keep his real name and his real persona. But the second thing we have to have in mind also is that it's always somehow the undecidable, because even that authentic Tim Crouch is just an inscribed Tim Crouch, a decision taken in advance to keep the name. In that respect, I think, and I hope I will also develop it in my written version, the question of theatrical name and the reference of the theatrical name and the power of the name to automatically invoke the identification between the persona of the actor and the character is also a very, I think, interesting theoretical question. How the name functions. You have in Slovenia a very salient example of Janez Janša. Just using the name is already a provocation of that kind of decision whether something is authentic or not, and playing with the expectations of the others with respect to our real identity.
Exactly. Yes, what I wanted to point out is not that I would think that theater can be authentic in this way, but that it has this innate wish to be as authentic as possible and never coming there.
Absolutely.
And so it's sort of pushing the literature out as being this image of unauthentic, fictional, but again, coming with new ways, but cannot eradicate the literature as such. So it comes back to dramatic, to post-dramatic, post-dramatic. Then we'll just keep adding the prefixes, I guess, to eternity.
This is this obsession with reaching the real. Reaching the real. I would rather use the real as a concept. Okay. Because, yes, I know that every day a sort of ordinary audience, as Nika Leskovšek would say, or Professor Lukan, the ordinary spectator, of course, he will rely on that idea of authenticity. He will have perhaps this impression, but perhaps we are also unfair to him. We think that he is always so naive. But it's true that the art is playing with that kind of, if you wish, also childlike response in everyone, even in the very scholarly equipped spectator. I'm always like a child when I go to the theatre. I'm always waiting like a child, let's surprise me, So even that is a kind of persona that we keep, and we respond to perhaps that wish for have an authentic contact with someone. But it is a mirage.
Yes, exactly.
It is a mirage.
Yes. But it's It's very precious what you show, that actually it's a tradition that goes way, way back.
Way back.
In different, of course, in different
Of course,
modes.
absolutely. One shouldn't collapse everything into
yes.
what was already before, because it's also a very retrograde idea. But one should not forget it.
Yes,
But
exactly.
what struck me really is that nobody, there is so much written about the author. No one sees this relation with Calderon. No one, for instance, at the end of the play, Tim Crouch as character, he says, should I pull, to punish myself, should I pull my eyes out, because eyes are the organ which is responsible for this wish to see. And nobody says, it's Oedipus, for Christ's sake. That's the end of Oedipus, So I think that even when discussing contemporary playwriting, we should always think about the entire tradition, I think.
Thank you. Any more questions? As we're ready, I suggest we continue with the first session that will be started by Špela Virant, a professor at the Faculty of Arts of the University of Ljubljana. She specializes in German literature and, of course, German playwriting. This is very interesting in the last years, and she will present. Boo. She will present her paper, Contemporary German Theatre Plays, or Capitalism Will Not Win.
Thank you. I'll talk in Slovenian, and I put just a few major points on the PowerPoint. So if you have any questions, I can explain it in detail in English or in German later on, but now I'll switch to Slovenian. So, hvala lepa za besedo, hvala za vabilo, hvala organizatorjem za trud. Ko sem maja letos pripravljala temo za tale referat, še nisem vedela, da bo v Gradcu na lokalnih volitvah zmagala komunistična stranka. Tako je pa pač tle nemška. Ampak s tem sem že v središču problematike pravzaprav. Namreč samo všečna podmena, da so umetniki in intelektualci avantgarda, ki sodobnim družbam kaže pot v boljšo, pravičnejšo prihodnost, se v preteklih letih hudo zamajala, saj nas dogajanja prehitevajo po levi in desni. Na vprašanje, ali je takšno, v najširšem smislu socialno-politično razmišljanje in delovanje, sploh naloga dramatike in gledališča v nemškem govornem prostoru precej enotno in odločno odgovarjajo pritrdilno. Nas pa seveda zanima, ali pri tem nastajajo nove inovativne ubeseditvene strategije. Preden bom poskusila odgovoriti na to, najprej zelo na grobo skiciram kontekst. Nemški govorni prostor je zaznamovan z visoko razvitim kapitalizmom. S tem ne mislim razvitosti gospodarstva in tehnologij, temveč razvitost različnih perfidnih oblik izkoriščanja. Istočasno pa ima ta prostor tudi dolgo in bogato tradicijo kritike kapitalizma in ideologije, tako v filozofiji kot tudi v umetnosti. Marx, Brecht in Adorno so ikone te kritike. Po drugi strani pa ima Nemčija tudi nič manj slavno tradicijo preprostih in zelo učinkovitih, ampak zelo napačnih rešitev za probleme razvitega kapitalizma, mislim seveda predvsem na nacionalsocializem in holokavst. Oboje seva tudi v sodobno nemško književnost, ki združuje izkušnje modernizma, postmodernizma in novih realizmov, ter jih nadgrajuje z izrazito političnim angažmajem, ki pa se lahko izraža na različne načine. Če se za hip pomudimo še pri kontekstu sodobne nemške književnosti, v katerega se dramatika umešča, ga lahko na hitro, na kratko, poantirano ilustriram s citatom iz romana Identity. avtorice mitu Sanjal, nemške avtorice Sanjal, ki je pravkar nominiran za največjo nemško literarno nagrado, 𝗀𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗃, in je hkrati tudi že bestseller. Junakinja, univerzitetna profesorica, pravi, citiram. Kot je lepo povedal Althusser, enoznačnost je primarna lastnost ideologije. Čim se nekaj kaže kot enoznačno ali očitno, vemo, da smo na področju ideologije, konec citata. Grobo rečeno, v sodobni literarni produkciji v Nemčiji nastajajo besedila, ki težijo k enoznačnosti oziroma enopomenskosti in ostajajo na področju ideologiji. In besedila, ki se temu enoumju upirajo in to problematiko tudi reflektirajo, tematizirajo. Kako je zdaj s tem konkretno v dramatiki? Jakob Hajner v knjigi Zakaj gledališče, ki je v nemškem izvirniku išla lani, v kratkem pa bo išla tudi v prevodu Mojce Kranjc v knjižni zbirki MGL, da že tako naredim malo reklame za knjigo. Torej Hajner zelo na kratko opravi sodobno dramatiko, ki po njegovem mnenju ne premore inovativnosti in nič ne pove o sodobnosti. V nadaljevanju opiše 4 tipe sodobnega političnega gledališča in jih vse zavrne. V vseh primerih politično ostaja na ravni vsebin in zunanje dekoracije navešene na konvencionalno realistične ali epigonalno postdramske forme. V najboljšem primeru to gledališče ne pove nič, v najslabšem pa potrjuje vladajočo ideologijo neoliberalnega kapitalizma in sicer tudi tam, kjer se zavzema za pravice manjšin obrobnih skupin, saj prikazuje preplet neoliberalnega kapitalizma in politike, ki ga podpirajo kot tako masiven in nepremagljiv, da zaduši vsako predstavo o možnih alternativah. V tej najboljši vseh možnih ureditev moramo samo še malo poskrbeti za emancipacijo doslej prezrtih, pa bomo imeli kapitalizem po meri človeka in vse bo v redu. Namesto takšne bolj ali manj zagrenjene, a dobrohotne in vedno parcialne kritike, Hajner od sodobnega gledališča zahteva, da s formalno inovativnimi prijemi gledalcev vzbudi verjetje, da se svet lahko spremeni in željo, da se ta sprememba udejanja. Citat naslovu današnjega predavanja je podnaslov igre Fritza Katerja 𝗀𝗫𝗄𝑔𝗇𝗀, 𝘀𝗶𝗺𝗀 material ali kapitalizem ne bo zmagal. Igra je bila premierno uprizorjena in natisnjena pomladi letos. Na prvi pogled bi lahko rekli, da ta naslov že izpolnjuje Hajnerjevo zahtevo, saj implicira, da obstaja nekaj, kar se kapitalizmu zoperstavlja in ga bo nekoč porazilo. Seveda takšna eksplicitna izjava v povezavi z aluzijo na mračno igro Medea material Hajnerja Müllerja, kaj hitro uduši vsako upanje in sugerira nasprotno branje, saj je vendar že zdavnaj zmagal. To je prost primer za to, kako se direktna kritika lahko sprevrže v potrjevanje vladajoče ideologije. Če po Hajnerjevem mnenju gledališka besedila danes ne izpolnjujejo njegovih pričakovanj, pa jih je kmalu potem, ko je napisal knjigo, izpolnila kar zunaj literarna realnost, zaustavitev življenja med pandemijo je pokazala, da se svet lahko spremeni in to čez noč, demonstracije, ki smo jim priča te dni tudi v Ljubljani, pa seveda kažejo, da želja po spremembah tudi že obstaja. Problem je, da se kapitalistični sistem v smrtnih krčih ponovno vzpostavlja še večjo krutostjo. Temeljito novih socialno-političnih alternativ, ki bi presegale le zamisli o kapitalizmu po meri človeka, pa še vedno ni. Ne pravim, da bi to bila naloga političnih gledaliških besedil, Ampak, če se vrnemo k Brechtu, njegov model temelji na V-efektu, na potujitvi, ki se spet naslanja na koncept ostranjenja, ki je bil za ruske formaliste temelj vse relevantne umetnosti. Gre za trenutek, ko se ustavimo, stopimo korak nazaj in se ogledamo, kako živimo, ogledamo si naše vedenje in vedenje. Predmet refleksije ni le delovanje družbe, temveč tudi način mišljenja, ki proizvaja takšno delovanje. Brecht je sicer stavil na ozaveščanje, na racijo, na razsvetljensko zaupanje, da bo človek popravil svoje napake, ko jih prepozna, zavedal pa se je, da je pot tja težavna. Ali je zdaj to njegovo epsko gledališče kaj pomagalo na tej poti, to je drugo vprašanje, ki nas tle več ne zanima. Ampak, če si sodobno dramatiko gledamo z tega vidika, torej z vprašanjem, kako prispeva k poglobljeni analizi dominantnih načinov mišljenja, razkrivanju njihovih zablod, iskanju izhodov, razgled, ki nam ga nudi, ni tako turoben, kot ga predstavlja 𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃. Na ravni ubeseditvenih strategij in struktur je za mnoga besedila značilno predvsem vračanje kompleksnosti, ki se kaže tako na ravni rabe tropov in figur, ritmizirane proze, verz, rim, aliteracij, naprimer pri Tereziji Valzer in Sibile Berg, pa na ravni kompleksnejših konstelacij likov, aluzijah in autorefleksivnosti, naprimer pri Tomasu Melleju, pa tja do poigravanja s časom, prostorom, različnimi fikcijskimi ravnmi, naprimer pri Rolandu Schimmelpfennigu. To vračanje kompleksnosti je z ene strani mogoče razumeti kot odziv na radikalno poenostavljanje jezikovnih sredstev v postdramskih in novorealističnih besedilih, z druge pa kot odziv na redukcionizem v javnih neliterarnih diskurzih. Čeprav neoliberalni kapitalizem v samopredstavitvah poudarja individualnost in raznolikost, v praksi čedalje bolj omejuje možne življenjske modele, zmanjšuje raznoterost estetskih praks in razmišljanja o svetu zvede na monokavzalne razlage, ki se stekajo na občih mestih o denarju in zdravju. Krepijo se želje po preprostih in učinkovitih rešitvah, tako pri oblastnikih, kot tudi pri tistih, ki se želijo sprememb. Vračanje kompleksnosti v gledališka besedila, torej reliterarizacija in repoetizacija dramatike, je oblika vnašanja večznačnosti, mnogopomenskosti na strukturni ravni. Na ta način se upira populističnim diskurzom in je v tem smislu politična, četudi, oziroma prav zato, ker ne prinaša hitrih in preprostih rešitev. V kontekstu populizma in senzacionalizma potujitveno učinkuje repoetizacija, ne pa, citiran, simuliran šok, ki se pajdaši z nasiljem. To je citat Tomasa Melleja iz igre Oda, ki je v tisku izšla lani in že z naslovom opozarja na lastno konceptualno repoetizacijo drame. Autorefleksivno Mellej nadaljuje, citiram, zato danes in tukaj ne kažemo nasilja, tudi če se pravkar za mojim hrbtom vzpostavlja diktatura. Konec citata. To zavestno distanciranje od pajdašenja z nasilja na ravni reprezentacije ni le sodobna oblika potujitve, temveč s kompleksnostjo uporabljenih sredstev tudi performativno, neposredno, čutno zaznavno kaže izhod iz redukcionizma, ki je ena od zablod danes dominantnega načina razmišljanja o svetu, gotovo pa ne edina. Ampak s tem dovolj za danes, ker je referat časovno omejen in tudi mene sili k poenostavljanju. Hvala.
Hvala, Špela. Špela. The discussion will be at the end of the session, so I would like to continue and go from the German playwriting to Croatian one. Martina Petranovič and Lucija Ljubić will be presenting their paper, The Poetic Tendencies of Contemporary Croatian Playwriting. Do you want to do it here?
Yes,
sure.
Yes.
Come.
Sorry. In 2020, the Croatian Ministry of Culture and Media received 71 submissions to the Marin Držić Award, the Best Croatian Contemporary Play Contest, which is the highest number of plays applied since the award was established 30 years ago, at the very beginning of the 90s, when the total amount of plays per year was far more modest than in the following and especially recent years. Thank you. Last year, candidates varied from well-established names who began their playwriting careers in the previous decades, some even prior to the 90s, Miro Gavran, Matko Sršen, Predrag Raos, Davor Špišić, Denis Peričić, Damir Mađarić, hrvoje_𝗏𝗏𝗏, Nina Mitrović. Recent winners of the award, Una Vizek, Marina Vojčić, Ružica Aščić. Two less known or emerging authors, Monika Herceg, Anja Pletikosa, Espi Tomičić, Dina Vukelić, Dorotea Šušak, Nikolina Rafaj. The plays revealed a wide-ranging field of interests, with special emphasis on the most recent incentives in global and local community, COVID-19 pandemic, earthquake in Croatia, and of formal strategies, generic designations, and stylistic qualities representing numerous nuances between more traditional forms of drama on one end and text marked by post-dramatic strategies on the other end of the spectrum. That alone can hardly stand for the undeniably prolific and diverse nature of contemporary Croatian playwriting over the last 30 years, but it can perhaps point us towards some significant elements that helped shape and define it. The emergence of several generations of Croatian playwrights since the 90s, the simultaneity of very variant writing practices that resist fixed classifications with regard to poetic affiliations and subject matter, even though certain similarities in formal characteristics, shared concerns, and approaches to playwriting and theater in general cannot be completely ignored. The institutionally driven revival of contemporary Croatian playwriting, branching into several different directions. The Best Play Award, the Marulić Day Festival dedicated to production of Croatian plays, the literary and theater journals committed to publication of contemporary national plays, Plima, Glumište, Teatar I Teorija, Kazalište, the specialized book series Mansioni Marin Držić Award series, the drama department of the Academy of Dramatic Art in Zagreb, the Croatian Center of ITI, the showcases, public readings, and playwriting workshops, the Croatian radio drama program, and the like. Established mostly with a few exceptions such as Kazalište Theater Journal in the 90s. Numerous problems, however, still remain, biggest of them being the fact that even though the majority of contemporary plays were eventually, if belatedly, staged, theaters themselves rarely served as incubators of midpoints of Croatian playwriting, with a couple of honorable exceptions normally related to creative visions of theater management, and that on more than one occasion, playwriting proved to be more progressive than theater dared to follow. In crude terms, the contemporary Croatian playwriting begins with the early 90s, parallel to the fundamental social, political, and cultural changes in both country and region, but mostly due to the new generation of young playwrights formed within the drama department at the Academy of Dramatic Art in Zagreb, and grouped around the 𝗀𝗃𝗃 Theatre and its contemporary creation drama program, the Prologue Theatre Journal, and later the 𝗫𝗲 Literary Journal. This unofficial group is said to create postmodern, intertextually focused plays marked by grotesque and parody, disintegration of characters, and lack of coherent plots, with little or no interest in politically charged and subversive subjects that so deeply concerned their predecessors in the 70s and 80s. The main representatives of this new kind of playwriting, Ivan Vidić, Asja Srnec-Todorović, Pavo Marinković, Milica Lukšić, Mislav Brumec, along with several other prominent playwrights that began their writing careers in the 80s, such as Lada Kaštelan, Miro Gavran, or Mate Matišić, to a large extent dominated the 90s. They continued to write into the new century, yet now their writing that began to show its face as early as the second half of the 90s revealed somewhat different poetic qualities closer to neorealistic model than before, even when pervaded by black humor, grotesque and fantastic elements, and topics devoted to more contemporary, personal or social issues. Lada Kaštelan, Posljednja karika, Mate Matišić, Anđeli Babilona, and Svećenikova djeca, Filip Šovagović-Cigla, culminating at the beginning of the new century, Ivan Vidić, 𝗀𝗃𝗃 and Veliki bijeli zec, Davor Špišić, 𝗀𝗃𝗃, Elvis Bošnjak, Nosenas rijeka, along with the next generation of authors that gave fresh incentive to creation playwriting in the new millennium in both its content and its form, such as Tomislav Zajec, Nina Mitrović, Ivana Sajko, Dubravko Mihanović, and Tena Štivičić, who, roughly speaking, emerged at the turn of the century, or Ivor Martinić, Olja Lozica, Dino Pešut, and Vedrana Klepica, who emerged in the second decade of the new century. If we were to turn our heads towards the predominant subject matters of the contemporary Croatian playwriting, it can be said, even at the risk of oversimplification and generalization, that the end of the 90s and the beginning of the new millennium were more nationally oriented in choice of overall topics, focusing on the independence war and its post-war traumas, and on the ordeals of transition to democracy and capitalism, as well as their often devastating consequences on both the individual and the society. On the other hand, the playwriting of the last 2 decades disclosed more global and international concerns, not entirely unrelated to the general changes in social and political circumstances in the country, the worldwide globalization processes, and the advance of European integrations. It will come as no surprise that some of the new millennium playwriting keywords therefore include globalization, migration, multiculturalism, integration, minority representation, personal identities, invalidity, and human rights. One of the most obvious examples in that respect is Tena Štivičić, now London-based Croatian playwright, who always, from the very beginning of her playwriting career, openly insisted on surpassing and crossing the narrow national borders, both figuratively and literally, in subject matters dealing with migration, multiculturalism, globalization, consumerism, xenophobia, personal, cultural, and international identities. Language, she writes in both Croatian and English, and available theater markets.
While the main concerns of Croatian playwrights in the late 19th and early 2000s still rested within the taboos of the 90s and the subsequent deconstructions of various aspects of national ideology, myth-making, and collective identity formation, such as obvious in Ivan Vidić 𝗀𝗃𝗃 and Veliki bijeli zec, for example, or war traumas like Filip Šovagović-Cigla or Mate Matišić pozdravna trilogija, the attention of Croatian playwrights in the 21st century seems to be more turned towards the representation of various types of personal identities, minorities, and socially constructed identities that fall outside the dominant and normative matrix. that is socially stigmatized, excluded, discriminated, and marginalized, such as ethnic and national minority groups, international refugees and migrants, poor and powerless, imprisoned, old-aged, physically or mentally disabled, gender minorities, etc., for example. 𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗏𝗧𝗧𝗏 in 𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 and Elvis Bošnjak in Otac writes about the imprisoned, 𝗀𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Prolazi sve about the old-aged, Ivor Martinić i Moj sin samo malo sporije hoda about invalidity. Plays and projects of 𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗏𝗀𝗏 discuss autism like in Vincent, minority identities such as poverty, disability, old age, and gender and ethnic minority in 𝗀𝗏𝗏, dementia in Zadnji put kad sam ti vidjela lice, depression in Dobro je ništa. Socially deprived working classes or the unemployed are the topic of also 𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏, sada je zapravo sve dobro and 𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗏, or 𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀 radnici u gladovanju, or 𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 example, Dino Pešut, are the topics of coming to terms with personal traumas of growing up and generational questions of the so-called millennials, like in Pritisci moje generacije, Posljednja panda ili Ostatici, and so on. While some recent playwriting reveals deep interests in issues of family traumas caused by conservative upbringing or even violence, sometimes but not always related to transgenerational violence or gender issues. There are several female authors who use their playwriting to actively analyze, decompose, and reinvent the position of women, often regarded as objects of either desire or abuse, in a male-dominated society, historically or in the present, locally or globally, such as Ivana Sajko, Vedrena Klepica, Jasna Žmak, etc. Elements of popular culture intersecting with media exploitation and manipulations, as well as media or more recently cyber violence, also entered the stage in several plays, such as Tomislav Zajec, John Smith, Princeza od Velca, or Darko Lukić, Važno je biti pozitivan, as did cooperative violence too, like in Ivan Vidić, Dolina Ruža, or Filip Nola, 𝗨𝗃_ći_j. A complex entanglement of private and public, fiction and faction, playwright and character, along with the absurdity of playwright's position in a mass culture, is exploited by Mate Matišić in his trilogies 𝗀𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗧𝗏 and Moji tužni monstrumi. While for some authors, questions of intimate relationships and topics that interest them on a highly personal level came first, like for example Lada Kaštelan, 𝗀𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀𝗀 Mihanović, Tena Štivičić, Ivor Martinić. Others, like for example Vedrena Klepica, insisted on writing about the globally seen, as she puts it, the state of the society, consciously setting aside subjective and individual preoccupations. For several authors, however, the imperative of being socially critical and provocative, or dramaturgically experimental, as proposed by one jury of the aforementioned Marin Držić Award, proved impossible to meet, and they openly dismissed it. In contrast to the 1990s, more playwrights in the new millennium revealed an interest toward more classic dramatic forms with straightforward plots, references to everyday reality, psychologically depicted and linguistically differentiated characters, discernible spatial and temporal coordinates, etc., as noticeable, for example, in plays written by Ivan Vidić, in contrast to the ones he wrote in the early 90s. He himself, for example, would say that his earlier plays were grounded in language, while his later plays are grounded in the harsh reality. And in the most prominent plays by Elvis Bošnjak, or in the playwriting of Tena Štivičić and 𝗀𝗶𝗺 Mihanović, whose writing was sometimes welcomed by theater criticism both in Croatia and abroad, as far as Tena Štivičić is concerned, as a long-awaited turn towards the sentimentalism and intimism opposed both to the brutalities of the new European drama and to the social disengagement, escapism, or even autism of Croatian playwriting dominant in the 90s. On the other hand, there are several playwrights, of course, who developed their own unique script marked by some of the post-dramatic strategies, most prominent being Ivana Sajko and Goran Ferčić, for example. Furthermore, there is more than one example of blurring the boundaries and intersecting the roles between the writer, director, or actor-performer. Actors are writers, like Elvis Bošnjak, Filip Šovagović, Filip Nola, etc. Writers are often directors of their own plays, like Filip Šovagović, Ivor Martinić, Olja Lozica, Vedrena Klepica, or performers, such as, of course, Ivana Sajko, who holds such performances the autoreferential readings. recent generations of playwrights see themselves more actively involved in process of writing theater and imagining their plays as performance text in line with the overall idea of theater event, regarding the written text only as a starting point or an element in the process of theater making, necessarily related to or subsumed to each performance, to the space and context of the production and of the performance, like Vedrana Klepica, Rona Žulj, Jasna Žmak, Jelena Kovačić, etc. One of their concerns isn't only the status of play within the performance, or impossibility or possibility of repeating the play or the text outside the context of a specific performance, like in a devising productions of 𝗀𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 that respect, it is necessary to perhaps underline the examples of symbiotic and long-term writer-director partnerships, such as, for example, between Jelena Kovačić and Anica Tomić, or more recently, Rona Žulj and Miran Kurzbahić. Some of the writers refashioned their approaches over the years and experimented with different writing procedures, form, and strategies, like Tomislav Zajec, Elvis Bošnjak, 𝗀𝗃𝗺𝗀𝗺𝗀𝗺, so that they are equally prone to creating classic plays finished before the production, modifying or developing their plays during rehearsal process, participating in collaborative writing processes and improvisations throughout rehearsals, building their plays with regard to specific actor, stage director, and practical theatrical circumstances, or writing down their plays as some sort of post-festum notes to the production itself. In 2020, indisputably marked by the pandemic and earthquakes, the Association of Croatian Screenwriters and Playwrights, web portal 𝗀𝗲𝗻𝗃 and 𝗀𝗀𝗻𝗃 Theatre Journal ventured into a joint effort of inviting 19 Croatian playwrights to write short monologues on the topic of isolation during the lockdown. Both the monologues and the subsequent theater production in the Zagreb Youth Theatre, directed by Anica Tomić, exposed some of the burning issues of the day, equally probing the minds of playwrights and of general public, but also demonstrated that formal closures in approaching to playwriting and in social life cannot completely obliterate the need of playwrights to write plays and to open themselves to dramatic dialogue with the world around them. Thank you.
Thank you. From Croatian playwriting, we'll go to the Slovak scene. We have Zuzana Timčíková on Zoom. She comes from Bratislava, from the Slovak Academy of Sciences and Arts. Is this working? We will put her on the screen, I hope. And she will be presenting a paper, Authenticity and Collective Works of Author Theatre, the Approaches of the Millennial Generation in Slovakia. Zuzana, do we hear each other? No? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. Can you hear me?
Sort of.
Sort of. Yeah, I have a presentation I want to share. Can I start already?
You can.
Okay. Thank you. Just confirming that you are seeing my presentations. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to start. Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Zuzana Timčíková, and I'm going to present the paper about authenticity in multi-authored works of authorial theatre in the approaches of the millennials in the capital of Slovakia. On the basis of examples from few productions in a group of Slovak theatre makers, actually mostly in Bratislava, theatre makers of one generation, so-called Generation Y or the Millennial Generation, I would like to point out certain similarities in approaches to creation that could be possibly seen as a manifestation of the shared value of this one generation. Its members are very close to each other in age. They were colleague mates studying various specializations in subsequent classes at the theatre faculty of the Academy of Performing Arts in Bratislava. And some of them have established their own theatres based as civil society organizations after the graduation. Let's mention, for example, Nude Theatre, Theatre Petr Mankovetsky, or Theatre Angle 92. Where they make theatre collectively, so on the principles of devised theatre. When saying about millennial generation, sometimes it's called also me generation, and this designation is based on the fact that the authors of several studies and articles from many fields define the millennials as selfish, narcissistic, self-centered generation compared to previous ones. An increased attention to oneself and a need for self-reflection or self-expression in terms of talking about oneself can be seen in stagings of several independent theatre makers of this so-called me generation in Bratislava. Although the open dramaturgy and the wide range of topics and approaches of the independent theatre makers active mainly in Bratislava reveals that, similarly to the previous generations, they also take an active interest in the world, in the developments, and in the people and their places in it, but they often do so through themselves. They give their personal statements in which they expose themselves to the audience from inside. They talk about their emotional and mental disposition, their values, their problems, their worries, their status in the general relationships in the broader social communities. They do not analyze major moral or ethic dilemmas, but trivial issues of everyday life. They view their existence also through the lens of the past and its messages. They compare themselves with the generation of their parents or grandparents and look for their self-determination also in confrontation with the past. They try to define their attitude to the models in which they grew up and find links with the past and with the things they experienced. They pay attention to their depression, frustration, existential crises, complexes, and their attitude to the virtual space and to social media. They share a constant quest for and re-evaluation of their external and internal identity as a framework to define themselves. This gives rise to a range of works in the form of scenic autobiographies characterized by large extent of authenticity. The theatre makers of this group approach their scenic reflections mainly through performative forms, where the actor or performer, as the author, talks about his past and present life and refers to actual events whose center is he himself or she herself. Now let us look at a few examples from the millennials on the theatre scene of Bratislava. This manner of artistic expression through authorial performances or auto-performances is close, for example, to nude theatre, which is female authorial theatre, dealing mostly with women's topic, and their productions exhibit attributes of documentariness, and they are based on authentic materials. The authors from this nude theatre opened the self-projection of their actually experienced reality and the problems and dilemmas associated with it, with the authorial performance called Samson. From its premiere in February 2014 until 2020, Samson was given 19 times, including the premiere. Samson is an allusion to a dream man destined to be one's life partner, who is actually the man performers live with. The essence of each show is the author's transformation in time connected to the change in their lives. The performers change primarily their verbal action, but maintain certain basic points and repeat several scenic actions in each show. For example, in 2014 shows of Samson, one of the performers tells the audience about her desperate desire to find a partner and mentions her authentic, embarrassing, but humorous dating experiences, whereas in 2019 shows, she talks about her marriage, which is already falling apart. Thematically, the sphere of the thesis analyzed in the repeats do not differ much, and the performers draw on everyday problems and trivialities of their lives. The audience becomes something like a sounding board for the effusions about their messy household, lunchbox diet, about being hungry while trying to lose weight, or the difficulties of logistics in a family with 2 children. The performers mention specific places and situations with which the audience members can identify and of which they may have their own memories. It appears that these seemingly ordinary details and the possibility to identify oneself in a given moment through what has been said enhance a feeling of authenticity in the audience members. It's not only the experiences, the stories, the problems, and the circumstances the performers share with the audience that are real. Authenticity gets even their manner of acting and working with the means of expression. The utmost civilian character and naturalness of their expression on stage and the complete denial of the principle of seeming language lift the audience out of illusion and convince them that whatever authors say, they mean it. Let's mention another example of the authors talking about themselves as a thematization of their everyday lives, also in a performative form, from among the creation of so-called millennials in Bratislava. It's a performance Big Need, which was performed back in March in 2017 by 4 authors. At that time, they felt a big need to show how the lives after the graduates of the School of Arts looked like, and sincerely admitted that to graduate from the Academy of Performing Arts doesn't automatically mean to get a job at Slovak National Theatres. These 4 performers lead more or less informal discussions and monologues on the stage about how they managed or didn't manage to start their careers in the community of artists and fulfill their visions after graduations. Commenting on their own experiences and feeling from ironic distance alternates with sincere confessions, often accompanied by sudden emotions and tears. These mentioned examples of authorial projects are based mostly on verbal actions in which the participants name the emotions they experience and reflect on themselves directly in front of audience. They are very simple verbal statements, verbal collages from the everyday lives of the authors, as well as from their inner world. Any physical action or any playing with the materialness of the body and of the other objects on the stage appears only to be illustrative action that enlivens the verbal aspects of the show. However, this appears to be what evokes feelings of authenticity in the audience. According to Czech director Barbara Herz, the effect or the authenticity of the overall expression of documentary work lies in its intentionally built desemantization, which is term taken from 𝗀𝗃𝗃 𝘀𝗃, when the traditional form of constructing meaning and working with the theatrical sign are weakened to the greatest possible extent. If these mentioned personal statements of the authors are perceived as a certain forms of documentary theater, and in terms of documenting the personal lives of the authors, the reduction of the theatrical sign leads to the simplicity of the statement and at the same time to a stronger effect of authenticity. The actors themselves becoming the bearers of the verbal stories and vividly expressed emotions on the stage is another factor that intensifies the feelings of authenticity. Barbara Herz notes that the enhancement of the impression of authenticity for the audience directly correlates with who conveys it. If the given conveyor has a personal relationship to the described event, so if he himself or she herself is the bearer, the audience automatically works with the awareness that the shared event concerns its so-called conveyor. The life character of the realities and the emotions conveyed to the audience through the me of the performer himself or herself naturally has a more effective influence on the perception of the works. If we put the question why in today's theatrical and performative arts the audience is so interested in autoreferential work in which the authors refer to their own realities and existence, Cheryl Grace, professor from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, could be the one who offers an interesting answer. She claims that any form of autobiography, and not only in theatrical arts, appeals to the audience and has become popular genre in Western countries because we live in a culture of me. Whether through talking about oneself in performative forms or through the acted out character is autobiographical plays, narrations about one's own self satisfy, according to 𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗀, people's basic voyeuristic impulses and hunger for stories, and in a way they guarantee the truth, the meaning, and the order man looks for in the world. Judging from these claims, the audience fondness for me narratives exceeds generational boundaries. Regardless of which generation the author recounting his story belongs to, he can find recipients in a broad spectrum because our time and its cultural and social conditions generate and enhance a need for such narratives in the audience. The mentioned examples of the theatrical production of theatre makers of the same generation in Bratislava are not stories with a powerful dramatic conflict, but only fragmentary images and verbal illustration of the outlooks of their bearers, mostly in anxiety or depression. They simply name their feelings, sometimes also the reason for them, in front of the audience. The authenticity of these types of theatrical statements, a form of mental hygiene for their participants that brings emotional satisfaction to the audience members, is received very positively not only by the audience, but by theatre critics too. As if today it was enough to talk about oneself, to share even one's most ordinary everyday story, and give it some basic framework of scenic through very simple expression, it will be received well. It's questionable, however, whether it is an explicitly generational fondness or only a phenomenon concerning a small group of theatre makers, mostly friends of each other, who have been artistically formed together and influence each other in the same environment. Thank you for your attention. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Zuzana. I'm now opening a discussion for the first three presentations. I would like Micha to get a microphone so that Zuzana will hear us. Now we have a question from Lada. This works? No? Yeah, I have. Okay.
Zuzana. Tomaž, unmute.
Okay, sorry. Now we'll open a discussion. Lada Čale Feldman already has a question. Can we fix it?
I think it was, congratulations to all the three presenters, four presenters. Do you hear me? I don't know. I think that Zuzana.
I will repeat the question. Obviously, you can only hear it from this microphone.
Okay, I think what is interesting is Professor Virant started with a value-laden comment on post-dramatic theatre, and then we have this nice intervention by Zuzana showing a certain uniformity and a certain, let's say, restriction of interest from capitalism and huge problems of humanity to just me. On the other hand,
I've been a member of the jury this last year, and I've studied the contest over the last 30 years, and I try to understand why certain plays were awarded or not, what was interesting to one jury or another. And in a most broad sense, I can say that it all depends upon the jury and its current values about what they think is interesting, what their opinion of a very well-written play is, or what is interesting to the audience or to the targeted audience. There are no fixed criteria as to what a good play or play that should be awarded is. Sometimes certain juries tried to impose sort of or propose some sort of criteria, for example, that they have to be socially engaged, critically provocative, that they have to be experimental or something like that. On the other hand, there were members of the jury who were perhaps more traditionally, and then they said, oh, finally we have some very well-written classic play, not the post-dramatic experimentation, and so on. So my final conclusion is, and that includes me as a member of the jury as well, that the choice of plays depends upon personal tastes of the members of the jury. Yeah, well, one tries to be objective and consider lots of things, but in the end, I think that's the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Very telling.
Yes, yes. Zuzana, do you have any comments on this part? How is it in Slovakia? The value of me drama? Sorry. Zuzana, do you have any comments on when it comes to prizes, when it comes to canonization of this new millennial drama? How is it in?
I think it's like very very general questions, but it's like I would say that. Or, for example, the theaters that I mentioned, these groups of theaters that I mentioned in my papers. What happens on what we can witness of, like when reading, for example, reviews for their performances. Anyhow it goes, or like any quality it is, it's always this word authenticity is used very often by the critics, and it's something that it's like very as I mentioned also in my paper, that's something that even it's yeah. So I just wanted to say that the critics they very often operate with this word authenticity, whatever it means, and but to say like what are the values, I don't know, it's like very very general, I would say.
Question from my God, a question from my side. When you were talking about this authenticity, so that these authors are mainly talking about themselves, about their emotions, about their everyday problems, but when perceived by the critics and the audience, isn't it that it is an image of a Y generation, so this new millennial generation? Is it perceived like that, or is it as a kind of a therapeutic situation, therapeutic process?
That's also maybe the question, like for me, and that I was trying to raise by the paper. That there, I think that this generational aspect is like one side of it. But when I like look at the audience of these groups, I would say that the members of this audience are mostly the people of the same generation, the friends of them, the colleague mates. So I think that like it's maybe the like when reading some this like sociological studies about the millennials generations, it gives a bit explanation why these performers, why these theater makers have this need to talk about themselves, to talk about their emotions. But I think it's like only one aspect of it, and it's also the question for me still.
Thank you. Do we have some more comments, questions from the audience? No? Then I would have one for Špela. You were talking about this play by Fritz Katter, Come As You Are. And you said that he offers kind of a solution for political theater, political play, in a way not representing the problem. Could you say a little bit more? Okay, then I misunderstood.
Katter is this one with capitalism won't win.
Okay.
Thomas Melle, Ode. It's not just him. It's my point was that sophisticated texts, not just simplification or minimal art in as we had for a certain period, early post-drama, early neorealistic plays. They were really minimalizing the language and the means of language. Now a kind of reportization, more sophisticated means are used, and Melle reflects it as well, explicitly, thinks about it, makes it one of his themes as a kind of solution. It's not a simple solution. It's not like we'll do that and everything will be okay. But it's just we should start to think again a bit more on complex terms. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, so. I do agree completely. My question would go that I have this sense that sort of it can be the form, so the form of a play, the challenge of understanding the play that brings us to a situation of wanting to understand the society and acting in some other way. Interesting shifts and so on. This is what I wanted to
The point is not to go clearly one direction, and now this is the new trend, and but okay, this is one way the market functions, you know. But Melle is a really specific author because he's writing novels as well, and he became famous with a novel. He wrote about his illness, his depression. So what he's doing here is ignoring these trends and says this is an old, or a kind of poetic form, and this is a drama, and he makes a drama and he reflects on it and uses verses, mixes all this stuff. Yeah. So in this way, it's becoming complex. How you achieve complexity? There's no recipe for it. Try it if it works. Yeah.
Yeah, the ways are really different, yeah.
Yeah.
Like we've seen with the Slovak case, with this
Yeah.
therapeutic way approach, with this poetic approach, with Lada talking about...
Yes.
So, do we have another question?
Thank you. I would have a question to our two Croatian colleagues, namely, you mentioned a traditionalist or traditionalists sitting in the committee you were a member of, right, last year. And since I have a sort of similar kind of approach in my paper, not approach, but topic, at least in the sense that I am looking for some, let's say, fictional approaches to the retelling of the world, I would be interested in knowing whether among all those texts that you mentioned and all those authors that submitted their texts to the 𝗀𝗧𝙚𝗀𝗐 Award, have there been any that would actually fit the description of fictionality, the classical drama, which I'm sort of, if I understood correctly, you're not too fond of, right? Something that you might, no? Then I do apologize. Well, if there were any, going in this direction.
I didn't put it right. I was talking about the juries of the National Award over the course of the last 30 years. And I was mentioning how these criteria were different according to the types of the jury at a certain period of time. Sometimes they were more traditional, sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were more, as I said already, prone to texts that were post-dramatic in character. They sometimes, once they did not assign the award, and they said that no text meet the criteria of a best written play, and that play should be more provocative in their content, that it should be more experimental in their form, and many writers rebelled against that and against the imperative of being like that. And for some, they said that they wanted to write the way they feel they should write, and write about the topics that concern them, whether they are personal or, I don't know, socially engaged or whatever. Yes, that's what I wanted to say. And at the beginning of our paper, we said that there were 71 texts, and they were so different, and they included the entire spectrum from what one would call the classic dramatic text to something that you would call post-dramatic.
So, if you have no further questions, a coffee break. We continue at 11:30 with the second session.